Part 1. The Day the Mirror Spoke Back. There comes a moment in every inner journey where the silence becomes too loud to ignore. When the distractions no longer work, when the masks start to crack, when the noise of the outside world fades just enough for you to hear the whisper in the mirror. At first, you don't recognize it. It's subtle. A flicker in the corner of your eye when you pass by your reflection, a sudden tightness in your chest when you're alone, a question you can't shake, who am I really, when I'm not pretending? That's when it begins. That's when the mirror stops reflecting who you wish to be and starts showing you what you've been running from. You stare, and it stares back, but not with your eyes. With something older, something deeper, something that remembers every lie you've told yourself just to survive. This is not the mirror of vanity, not the mirror of grooming. This is the ancient mirror, the one that reveals the shadow. The one that doesn't care about your image, your status, your story. It shows you the part of yourself you buried, denied, or disowned. And if you're brave enough, it lets you meet the demon that lives in the forgotten corners of your psyche. From the very beginning of human thought, philosophers have warned us about this mirror. Socrates told us, the unexamined life is not worth living. But he didn't mean surface-level introspection. He meant the brutal, raw confrontation that drags your ego into the light and forces you to ask, what have I become? Not what the world sees, what you see. When no one is watching, when the performance ends, when the lights go out. That is the moment of truth. And it is terrifying. This mirror doesn't lie. It shows you the exact moment you gave up your integrity. The exact moment you decided it was easier to be liked than to be real. It shows you the behaviors you justify, the relationships you maintain out of fear, the fake smiles, the passive-aggressive words, the moments of cowardice you masked as compassion. It shows you the addiction, not just to substances, but to validation, to power, to being right. The mirror is brutal, but it is also sacred, because nothing changes until it is revealed. Here's the truth: most people never make it to this mirror. They live their entire lives avoiding it. They build empires, families, reputations, all to outrun the reflection they refuse to face. They bury themselves in achievement, in pleasure, in distraction. But the mirror waits. It doesn't age. It doesn't forget. It only becomes louder. And one day, when the noise of the world no longer satisfies, it calls your name. Not with words, but with emptiness.
Click subscribe to this channel to get more profound insights.
And so you stand there, finally, face to face with your own shadow. And the demon in the mirror begins to speak not in language, but in memory. It shows you the moment you learned to lie to protect yourself. The moment you were told your emotions were too much. The moment you decided that being accepted was more important than being authentic. And suddenly you realize the demon is not evil. The demon is wounded. It's you. It's the part of you that was exiled for feeling too deeply, for needing too much, for being too real in a world that only rewards masks. Carl Jung called this the shadow self, the part of the psyche we repress, not because it is bad, but because it is unacceptable, not to your soul, but to society. And yet, what is repressed does not die. It festers. It gains power. And when ignored long enough, it begins to take control. not through possession, but through projection. You see your own darkness in others. You blame them for what you refuse to face in yourself. And this is where true suffering begins, not from what others do to you, but from what you are unwilling to own. So what happens when you finally stop blaming, stop running, and start listening to the demon in the mirror? Something unexpected. At first, it screams, not because it's angry, but because it's been alone for so long. It throws every fear at you, every shame, every regret. It tests you. It wants to know if you'll abandon it again, if you'll look away like you always have. But when you stay, when you look it in the eyes and say, "I see you," something shifts. The demon softens. Not all at once, but enough for you to realize it was never trying to destroy you. It was trying to protect the part of you that was too fragile to live in this world. The part that was betrayed. The part that was silenced. The part that was broken and never given time to heal. The demon is the guardian of your pain, and the pain is the doorway to your power. Let me ask you something most people will never dare to consider. What if the parts of you that you hate the most are actually the keys to your freedom? What if your anger is not a flaw, but a boundary that was never allowed to form? What if your jealousy is not pettiness, but a signal that your soul is starving for its own potential? What if your insecurity is not weakness, but a cry for the love you never learned to give yourself? This is not about indulging the shadow. This is about integrating it, because integration is the only true exorcism. You do not kill the demon, you reclaim it. You do not suppress the shadow, you welcome it home. This is what Jung meant when he said, "I'd rather be whole than good," because wholeness includes the shadow. Goodness, as defined by culture, often excludes it. But the soul does not seek perfection. It seeks truth. And here's where the philosophy meets the practical. Facing the demon in the mirror is not a one-time event. It's a practice, a devotion, a daily choice to confront what is uncomfortable instead of escaping into what is easy. It's turning off the noise and sitting with your own thoughts. It's noticing when you're triggered and asking, what part of me is still unhealed? It's seeing your worst moments not as failures, but as messages. And it's having the courage to rewrite the story you've been telling yourself about who you are. The mirror will not flatter you. It will not lie to you. But it will free you if you let it. Because freedom is not the absence of darkness. It is the presence of awareness. When you know your shadow, you are no longer controlled by it. You become conscious. You become sovereign. You become whole. And then something miraculous happens. You begin to see the demon in others not with fear, but with compassion. You recognize their projections, their wounds, their defenses. And instead of reacting, you respond. Instead of judging, you understand. Instead of running, you hold space. Because you have already faced your own reflection and you survived. But it all begins with that one moment, that one choice. To stop turning away, to stop performing. To look into the mirror and ask the question most fear to confront. Who am I, really, when there's no one left to impress? And when you ask that question, the mirror answers. Part 2, the breakdown before the breakthrough. There's a moment after the first confrontation with the demon in the mirror, a moment where everything you thought you were begins to fall apart. It's disorienting. It feels like death. And in many ways it is. Not a physical death, but the death of illusion. The death of the persona you spent your whole life building. The death of the false identity that kept you safe, but also kept you small. Most people think that facing your shadow will give you relief. But the reality is far more raw. It breaks you open. The breakdown isn't a sign of failure. It's the beginning of truth. When the ego starts to unravel, it feels like losing your center. You question everything: your beliefs, your goals, your relationships. You wonder if anything you've built is real. And the scariest part, you're not sure who you are without the mask. This is where the real spiritual and psychological work begins. Because this is where you choose: collapse back into illusion or move forward into integration. Nietzsche wrote, "You must have chaos within you to give birth to a dancing star." The chaos you feel after confronting your inner demon is not meaningless. It's sacred. It's the clearing out of everything that no longer aligns with your truth. But it's also dangerous terrain. This is where many people relapse into old patterns. They reach for the very addictions they swore they had defeated. They go back to toxic relationships. They self-sabotage. Not because they're weak, but because the ego fears annihilation more than it fears suffering. You see, the ego would rather live in a familiar hell than step into an unknown heaven. It's addicted to control. And the moment you face the demon in the mirror, you begin to see how much of your life has been built on control. You controlled how people see you. You controlled what parts of yourself were allowed to exist. You controlled your emotions, your image, your narrative. But now the control is slipping, and what's left is raw presence, vulnerability, realness. And that, ironically, is where your true power lies. But let's be honest, power doesn't feel powerful at first. It feels like exposure, like standing naked in front of the world with no defense. You feel everything: the grief, the rage, the regret, the longing. Feelings you buried years ago come rushing to the surface. And it's overwhelming. But this is not a regression, it's a resurrection. The emotions you couldn't process before are now asking to be witnessed. Not fixed, not analyzed, just witnessed. This is where the practice of radical self-honesty comes in. You have to stop lying to yourself about what you want, about what you feel, about what you're afraid of. The lies may have protected you once, but now they're poison. They keep you trapped in a reality that's too small for your soul. As Soren Kierkegaard said, the most common form of despair is not being who you are. And the demon in the mirror doesn't want you to despair, it wants you to wake up. So how do we move through this breakdown without losing ourselves in it? First, we must learn to sit in the discomfort, not escape it, not numb it. Just sit, breathe, listen. This is where meditation becomes more than a trendy habit, it becomes a lifeline. Not a way to silence the mind, but a way to see the mind, and to observe the chaos without becoming it. To let the storm pass through you without reacting to every flash of lightning. Second, we must begin to tell the truth not just to ourselves, but to the world. This is where authenticity becomes non-negotiable. You start saying what you actually mean. You start setting boundaries that reflect your worth. You stop performing. And yes, it costs you. People will leave. Opportunities will vanish. Your old life will begin to dissolve. But what emerges in its place is something far more valuable: alignment. You begin to live a life that matches your soul, not your mask. And here's the mystical secret that few talk about. When you begin to live in truth, the demon in the mirror transforms. It doesn't disappear. It evolves. It becomes an ally, a guide, a reminder of what happens when you abandon yourself, and an anchor that keeps you rooted in realness. You no longer fear it because you've integrated it. And that integration is what Jung called individuation, the process of becoming a whole, unified self. But before that happens, you will be tested. Life will send you mirrors everywhere. In your relationships, in your work, in your quiet moments. People will trigger the very wounds you thought you healed. Situations will challenge your new boundaries. And the demon will whisper again, not as loudly as before, but just enough to make you doubt. This is where your practice becomes your path. You have to remember, just because the demon returns doesn't mean you failed. It means you are still being watched by your shadow, and it wants to know, will you choose yourself this time? This is the moment where philosophy meets psychology, and psychology meets spirituality. You are not just healing your trauma, you are rewriting your identity. You are no longer the victim of your story. You are the author. And every choice you make from this point forward either feeds the old identity or births the new one. That's why the stakes are so high. Because this isn't just about healing wounds. It's about reclaiming your power. Let me ask you something very few have the courage to consider. What if the version of you you're trying to become already exists, but it's trapped behind the lies you still believe? What if all it takes to become free is to stop betraying yourself, one choice at a time? What if the demon in the mirror was never trying to destroy you but to purify you? Because that's what happens when you face the demon long enough. You begin to see its true face. Not evil, not monstrous, but sacred. It was holding the pain you couldn't hold. It was carrying the burden you couldn't name. And now, because you've returned, it can finally rest. You don't need to kill it. You need to thank it. And then, you need to take back the parts of yourself it has been protecting all along. This is the breakthrough. But it only happens after the breakdown, after the ego has collapsed, after the illusions have shattered, after the storm has passed. What's left is not a perfect, enlightened being. What's left is you, raw, real, radiant, and finally free. Part 3, becoming the mirror itself. At some point, if you keep going, if you keep choosing truth over illusion, presence over escape, and love over fear, something extraordinary begins to happen. You stop just seeing the demon in the mirror, and you become the mirror itself. Not in a narcissistic way, not in a self-obsessed way, but in the deepest, most sacred sense, you become a clear, grounded, unshakable reflection of reality. You no longer see life through the eyes of your wounds, you see it through the clarity born of integration. This is where the journey becomes less about you and more about what flows through you. You're no longer trying to fix yourself. You're no longer trying to prove your worth. You've stopped performing. You've stopped hiding. You've stopped running. And in that stillness, that presence, that raw, unmasked honesty, you become something most people never become in their entire lives, a sovereign being. Not because you dominate others, but because nothing inside you remains fragmented. When you become the mirror, people feel it. They won't always understand it, but they'll feel it. Some will be drawn to you, not because you're perfect, but because you're real. Others will be repelled because your presence will reflect back everything they're still avoiding. Your clarity will challenge their confusion. Your wholeness will confront their fragmentation. Your truth will awaken their buried lies. And this is where the final test begins. Not the test of facing the demon in yourself, but the test of facing it in others without losing your center. There's a quiet, almost mystical strength in someone who has faced their own shadow. They don't need to react. They don't need to control. They don't seek revenge. They don't prove, because they've already walked through the fire. They've already died 1,000 ego deaths. They've already been broken and reborn. And so they walk with a kind of calm that cannot be faked, a kind of depth that cannot be explained, a kind of presence that says, without words, I know who I am, and I know what I'm not. But this maturity doesn't make you superior. It humbles you. Because the more you see into yourself, the more you begin to understand others. You see their pain. You see their masks. You see their demons not with judgment, but with compassion. And yet you also no longer participate in their illusions. You don't enable. You don't rescue. You don't shrink. Because compassion without boundaries is self-betrayal. And you've already made that mistake. Never again. At this stage, life becomes less about seeking and more about offering. You begin to serve, but not from ego. Not to be seen, liked, or admired. You serve because your cup is full. Because your shadow is integrated. Because you've remembered who you really are beneath all the noise. And the irony is, this is when your impact becomes the greatest. Not when you try to change people, but when you become a living example of what it looks like to be undivided. This is the level of consciousness that ancient mystics, philosophers, and sages devoted their lives to reaching. The Stoics called it ataraxia, inner tranquility untouched by external chaos. The Buddhists called it equanimity, the ability to hold all things without clinging or resisting. The Taoists called it wu-wei, effortless action, flowing in harmony with the Tao. And Jung simply called it wholeness. Whatever name you give it, the feeling is the same. You are no longer at war with yourself. Let me ask you a question that might change your life. What if your life's purpose isn't to become someone else, but to remember who you were before the world told you to be afraid of yourself? What if the demon in the mirror was never a monster, but a messenger, a sacred guardian of your most authentic self, waiting for you to stop pretending? Because that's the final revelation. The demon was never your enemy. It was your shadow, your unhealed protector. And once it trusts that you're ready, it no longer tries to control you. It becomes fuel. It becomes wisdom. It becomes fire, not the fire that burns, but the fire that illuminates. And suddenly you find that all the things you used to fear, the pain, the shame, the failure, they don't have power over you anymore. You've walked through them. You've faced the mirror. And now you are the mirror. This doesn't mean life becomes easy. It means you become equipped. You'll still face challenges. You'll still feel grief. You'll still be misunderstood. But now, you won't collapse. You won't betray yourself just to be accepted. You won't lose your voice just to keep the peace. You've made peace with the only war that ever really mattered, the war within. And once that peace is made, the whole world begins to look different. You begin to see through the illusions that once controlled you. You no longer chase love, you radiate it. You no longer seek approval, you embody truth. You no longer fear loneliness because you've tasted the deepest solitude and found yourself there. This is what it means to become whole. This is what it means to know thyself, not as an idea, but as a lived reality. And now you carry the mirror with you, not to shame others, but to reflect their forgotten light. You become the one who sees clearly, even when others are blind. You hold a space so still, so silent, so honest, that people begin to feel parts of themselves they've long forgotten. Not because you preach, but because presence is more powerful than any performance. In truth, when embodied, speaks louder than any words. So I'll leave you with this. What if everything you've ever feared in yourself was simply waiting to be loved? What if the demon in the mirror was just the gatekeeper to your own liberation? What if facing your shadow wasn't the end, but the beginning? Not of perfection, not of fame, but of sovereignty, of peace, of power. You don't need to run anymore. You don't need to fight. You don't even need to search. You just need to look into the mirror and stay. Because when you finally face the demon in the mirror, you find out it's not a demon at all. It's you, unmasked.